At 73 years old, George Strait has finally said the words fans never expected to hear. Words about a fellow country music legend he's rarely spoken of publicly. Toby Keith. For decades, Strait was the quiet giant of country music, letting his music do the talking while others chased headlines. But now, something's changed. In a rare moment of raw honesty, George broke his silence and opened up about Toby, not just the performer, but the man behind the music. Why now? And what did Strait see in Keith that made him speak out after all these years? Their careers ran in parallel. Different sounds, different styles, but something deeper connected them. And in his own soft-spoken, heartfelt way, George Strait finally pulled back the curtain on their bond, their differences, and the moment Toby did something that shook even the king of country to his core. The truth is, George had been holding something in, and at 73, he's finally ready to let it out. George Strait and Toby Keith, two towering names in country music, yet so fundamentally different in how they carried themselves. Strait was the quiet cowboy, built from the dust and discipline of Texas ranch life. Keith was the loud patriot, bursting into the scene like a firecracker, never afraid to speak his mind or rattle cages. But behind those differences lay a surprising truth. The two men shared more in common than most people ever realized. George reflected on those early years with clarity. Toby came in like a storm, he said, recalling the mid-90s, when Keith's brand of country, gritty, rebellious, and infused with raw Americana, began dominating the airwaves. Strait, already a legend by that point, didn't bristle at Toby's rise. He respected it. He had something to say, and he said it his way. George admitted, "You've got to admire that." Though their styles stood miles apart, Strait with his neo-traditional ballads and Keith with his rowdy anthems, their foundations were built on the same values: faith, country, family, and pride. "We both came up through the hard way," Strait said. "Earned it one bar, one honky-tonk at a time." But there was a distance between them too. Not animosity, just space. Strait was famously private, rarely making statements or involving himself in public feuds or industry politics. Keith, on the other hand, was bold, unfiltered, and at times controversial. Yet George never judged him for that. Instead, he admired Keith's refusal to bow to pressure. He didn't care what the suits said, George remembered. Toby made his music for the people and he didn't flinch. That takes guts. They ran into each other over the years, at award shows, benefits, and country music events. Strait smiled as he recalled Toby's larger-than-life presence backstage. He'd walk in with a grin, hug you hard, and make you feel like you were the only person in the room. That genuine energy stuck with George. Long after the cameras were off and the crowds faded, Toby wasn't about playing the part. He was the part. As George spoke, it became clear his tribute wasn't about musical notes or radio hits. It was about respect, quiet, lasting, and deeply personal. And as he continued to reflect, it became obvious. Toby Keith may have been louder, brasher, and more unfiltered, but in George Strait's eyes, he was also real. And real recognizes real. While George Strait had always admired Toby Keith's tenacity, there was one moment, one song, that forever changed the way he saw him. It wasn't at an award show or during some backstage handshake. It was in the wake of national tragedy, when America was grieving and raw. That's when Toby Keith released Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue. And according to George, it hit him like a punch to the chest. Strait recalled hearing the song for the first time on the radio during a long drive through Texas. The lyrics, fiery, unapologetic, and burning with patriotism, didn't just grab his attention. They stopped him cold. "I had to pull the truck over," he said. "It was more than a song. It was a message. You could feel the anger, the pride, the heartbreak in every word, and it spoke for a lot of folks who didn't know how to say it." Strait had always taken pride in being a patriot himself, but his approach was measured, traditional. He sang from the heart, but kept his politics out of the spotlight. Toby did the opposite. He shouted from the rooftops, waved the flag, and never cared if someone disagreed. "That takes a different kind of courage," George admitted, "especially when the world's watching and waiting to tear you down. For the first time, George reached out directly. He called Toby and left a simple message. "You nailed it." It was a brief moment between two giants of country music. No cameras, no headlines, just a call of respect from one cowboy to another. And it stuck with Keith, who later told others how much that call had meant. In a world full of industry competition and backroom politics, this was rare, genuine acknowledgement from a man who didn't hand out compliments easily. Strait later reflected that the song did more than capture a moment. It cemented Toby's place in history. A lot of artists tried to write the song of the times after September 11th, George said. But Toby was the song of the time. He said what people needed to hear. And that was the turning point. From that moment on, George didn't just respect Toby Keith as a hitmaker, he respected him as a voice of a generation. A man unafraid to be bold, a fellow cowboy who rode a wilder trail, but one that led to the same place, the heart of America. Despite their differing approaches to fame and music, George Strait never underestimated Toby Keith's impact on the genre they both called home. In fact, George admitted there was something Toby brought to country music that he himself never could: unapologetic disruption. Toby shook the room when he walked in. George said with a slow smile, "Not a lot of people do that in our world." Strait elaborated on how Toby Keith redefined the public image of a country star. Where George embodied stoic tradition, Toby was the bold outlaw with a mic. And it wasn't just his image, it was his music. Keith's songs captured the working man's frustrations, pride, and resilience in ways that felt like fire to a gasoline-drenched audience. George, whose own catalog thrived on romance, heartbreak, and tradition, saw something powerful in that. He made people stand up and listen, even the ones who didn't agree with him. Strait said, "That's hard to do without losing yourself in the noise." But Toby never did. He stayed Toby, always. And while many in the industry occasionally dismissed Keith as too brash or too political, George saw the deeper truth. Toby was giving voice to the same people George had always sung for, the blue-collar America that showed up to every show, sang every lyric, and lived through every line. Only difference was, Toby said it loud. Strait especially admired how Toby weathered industry criticism. People in the suits didn't always like what he had to say, but that didn't stop him. George paused, then added something rare for a man so private. "I wished I had that in me sometimes." That confession meant more than fans could have imagined. For decades, George had been known for playing it close to the vest, rarely ruffling feathers, rarely speaking out. But in Toby, he saw a kind of bravery he hadn't dared explore. And as the years passed, that admiration only grew. He wasn't trying to be the next anybody, George said. He was too busy being the first Toby Keith, and whether you loved it or not, you had to respect it. In that reflection, it was clear. Behind the contrast in styles stood two men cut from the same cloth, just sewn with different stitches, both stubborn, both proud, and both committed, above all else, to keeping country music honest. George Strait had spent a lifetime carefully separating his music from the tabloid world, but even he couldn't ignore what Toby Keith endured in his final years. When the news broke about Toby's battle with stomach cancer, it sent a shockwave through the country music world, but for George, it hit especially hard. "It's like hearing that the toughest man in town took a bullet," he said quietly. "You think, no, not him. Not Toby." Toby had always seemed larger than life, unshakable, a guy who could walk into any room, light it up, and walk out with a grin. That kind of presence makes you believe in invincibility. But behind the scenes, George knew the truth. Toby wasn't invincible. He was just unflinchingly brave. He kept showing up, even when he was hurting, even when people didn't know he was hurting. George said, "That's not just strength, that's love. For the fans, for the music, for the life he built." Strait recounted a private moment, one the world never saw. It was at a charity event in Texas. Toby had lost noticeable weight, and while he still had that swagger in his walk, George could see the toll in his eyes. They didn't talk long, just a handshake, a nod, and a short sentence from Keith. "Still got songs to sing." George never forgot it. "That line stayed with me," George admitted, because when you boil it all down, that's what we're here for. We ain't here for awards or headlines. We're here to tell stories. And Toby never stopped telling his. As Toby's condition worsened, George watched the industry slowly realize what they were about to lose. Tribute posts flooded in. Artists who'd once kept their distance were suddenly praising him, but George didn't wait for the funeral. He made his calls. He said his piece. "We wait too long in this business," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We wait till someone's gone to say how much they mattered. But I didn't want to do that with Toby. I wanted him to know." And Toby did. Before he passed, he told a close friend, "George Strait called me the real deal. That's all I ever needed." For George Strait, stoic, humble, reserved, it was a rare window into his heart, a moment where admiration turned into action, and it revealed a simple truth. The king of country didn't just respect Toby Keith, he loved him as a peer, as a fighter, as a brother in boots. In the quiet moments that followed Toby Keith's passing, George Strait found himself haunted by memories, some shared, many unspoken. The country music world moved fast, but George moved slower these days, and in that slowness came reflection. He looked back on a particular night in 2004, when they'd both been nominated for the same award. George had won. Toby clapped the hardest in the room. "I remember thinking, he wanted that one," George said, but he stood up and clapped like it didn't matter. That's a different kind of class. It was easy to underestimate Toby when all you saw was the boots, the flag, the fire. But George had looked deeper. He saw a man who gave generously behind the scenes, a man who visited troops overseas without a single reporter in tow, a man who took calls from struggling artists late at night and gave them advice without ever boasting about it later. People saw the fire, George said, but they didn't always see the heart. That heart, George would later learn, extended to Toby's final tour. Despite his illness, Toby pushed to play shows in small towns, places other stars skipped. He said those were the places that built him, and he wanted to give them one last show. George, hearing this, quietly sent Toby's team resources, sound crews, drivers, even stagehands, just to make the journey easier. He never told the press. He didn't need to, because George Strait, like Toby, understood that real country music isn't about the headlines. It's about the handshakes in the wings, the nods across dressing rooms, the mutual understanding that you've both walked the same dirt road and you both paid for your boots with miles. As tributes poured in from every corner of the industry, George remained silent for a while. Not because he didn't care, but because he was still finding the right words. "I don't rush when it comes to grief," he said. But when he finally spoke, it was on stage. At a show in Fort Worth, George paused before his final song. The band quieted, the crowd leaned in, and in a moment of raw simplicity, George tipped his hat to the sky and said, "This one's for Toby. A real one." He sang, "The Cowboy Rides Away," not for himself, but for Toby. And the crowd knew it. In that moment, no words were needed. Two legends, so different, yet bonded by the same trail, shared one last ride, and George made sure it ended with dignity, respect, and love. As George Strait continued performing quietly in select venues, often in Texas or Las Vegas, his fans began to notice a change. Not in his voice, it was still strong, weathered like leather but never broken, but in his presence. Something heavier hung behind his eyes, and those who knew him best said it was Toby. You don't realize how close you were to someone until they're not around anymore, George confessed during a private backstage conversation after a show. And you start thinking about what you never said. He didn't mean regrets in the usual way. He and Toby had always kept it real, even if their relationship wasn't built on weekly phone calls or public collaborations. It was deeper than that. It was a mutual understanding born from years spent backstage, in bus parking lots, under the lights, and far from them. They were different brands of the same storm, one silent thunder, the other roaring lightning, but both rode for the same cause, real country music. There was one conversation George kept replaying. Years ago at a Nashville benefit dinner, Toby had cornered him, not in a bad way, but in the way Toby Keith did, when he had something real to say. He looked George in the eye and said, "They're watering it down, man. One day, it's just gonna be glitter and TikTok dances unless guys like you and me keep the fence posts in the ground." George didn't say much at the time. He just nodded. But now, that moment rang louder than any radio hit. In recent years, George Strait had made subtle choices that seemed to echo Toby's words. He refused to collaborate with auto-tuned artists. He took younger country singers under his wing, those who reminded him of the grit, the edge, the fight Toby had. And when he did speak up, like during a quiet speech at the Country Music Hall of Fame, he didn't name names, but he made it clear the soul of country music was in danger, and it was up to the old guard to keep it alive. "You don't have to be loud to make a stand," George said, "but sometimes the quiet ones gotta step up too." In that, George Strait was finally embodying what Toby had always asked of him: not to change, not to be someone else, but to care louder. And for the first time in decades, George's voice, steady, respectful, and rooted, was rising like a flag on the horizon. Not to replace Toby Keith's, but to honor it, to carry the weight now that his brother was gone. George Strait had never been one for award speeches or viral moments, but in the months following Toby Keith's passing, something shifted. At 73, he began speaking more boldly, showing a rare willingness to reflect not only on the state of country music, but also on the friends he'd lost along the way. And there was one appearance that made headlines, not because of what George did, but because of what he refused to do. It was a televised tribute concert, hosted by a major network, designed to honor Toby Keith's legacy. Dozens of performers lined up, slick production, glossy lights, cameras ready. George was invited, of course. They wanted him front and center, but he declined. Not out of disrespect, but because, in his words, Toby wouldn't have wanted it that way. Instead, George put together his own tribute, privately organized, held in a Texas dance hall with a few hundred close friends, fans, and musicians who had shared the road with Toby at one point or another. There were no lights, no handlers, no clickbait, just stories, music, and a lot of raw emotion. George played a stripped-down acoustic set, beginning with Amarillo by Morning, before surprising the crowd with a cover of Toby's "You Shouldn't Kiss Me Like This." It was a moment nobody expected. George Strait had never covered Toby Keith in concert. Not once, but that night, the words came through his voice with reverence, and by the final verse, he had to pause, eyes glistening before finishing. Afterward, he shared a story no one had heard before. Years earlier, Toby had sent George a demo, not for a collab, not for approval, just because he wanted George to hear a song that hadn't found a home. It was called "The Ones Who Don't Say Much." George kept that demo. He never recorded it, never released it. Until now. Later that year, without fanfare, George released a live acoustic version of that very song as a bonus track on a limited edition vinyl. No press release, no interviews, just a simple liner note. "For Toby, your voice still echoes." It was George Strait's quiet rebellion against the noise of modern country. A salute to a brother who dared to sing loud. And in doing so, George proved that sometimes the strongest tribute isn't found on stage, but in the silence that follows, and the songs that still matter long after the lights go down. As the dust settled and the music industry moved forward, as it always does, George Strait found himself thinking about legacy in a way he never had before. At 73, he'd long since secured his place in country music history. 60 #1 hits, more than 100 million records sold. CMA Entertainer of the Year, Country Music Hall of Fame inductee, his achievements filled pages. But now, with Toby Keith gone, George began to ask deeper questions. What do we leave behind when the lights go out? What's the last story people will tell about us? For George, those questions didn't come from a place of ego. They came from love, from respect, from watching the world mourn a man who had, at times, been polarizing, but who, in death, was suddenly remembered for all the right reasons. That contrast struck him. The applause always came louder after the curtain fell. In a rare radio interview, George spoke more candidly than fans had ever heard. The host asked what he missed most about Toby Keith. George paused, cleared his throat, and said he wasn't afraid. "That's what I miss. He told the truth, even when it cost him something. We don't have many like that anymore." The room went silent. Then George went further. "You know," he said slowly, "Toby reminded me that country music ain't just about melodies and charts. It's about backbone and heart and saying something even if it ruffles feathers. I think I forgot that for a while." It was the most personal confession George Strait had ever made in public. Fans and fellow musicians alike took notice. Social media lit up. Younger artists began sharing clips of the interview, adding messages like, "The King gets it," and "We need more truth in country." George had, perhaps without meaning to, sparked a movement. In the months that followed, something else changed. George, who had long turned down invitations to serve on panels or give public endorsements, began mentoring behind the scenes. Not with press releases, not with fanfare, but in small, quiet ways. He invited rising artists to his ranch. He gave feedback on songs. He made phone calls to record executives and fought for authenticity. And time again, he brought up Toby. "There was a time when this business tried to push Toby out," George told one artist. "Too loud, too rough, too honest. But he kept showing up. That's how you win. That's how you stay real." Privately, George also began working with the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation, named for his late daughter, to quietly expand its mission. Inspired by Toby's long history of supporting military families, George included new grants aimed at helping veterans and their children gain access to arts education. He didn't announce it, but those close to him knew. It was Toby's influence again. And then came the biggest surprise of all. At a small concert in Austin, George Strait debuted a brand new original song. It wasn't promoted in advance. No one expected it. He simply walked to the mic, tipped his hat, and said, "This is for a cowboy who rode hard," sang louder than the crowd, and left a hole none of us can fill. The song was called "He Wore the Truth Like Boots," and it was unmistakably about Toby Keith. The lyrics told of a man who didn't ask permission to speak, who stood when others sat, who wrote songs with blood and bone instead of polish and pretense. It was the kind of tribute only George Strait could deliver. Simple, raw, and piercing. The crowd rose to their feet before he finished the final chorus. Some wept, some sang along. All knew they were witnessing more than a performance. They were witnessing a passing of the torch. In his final verse, George sang, "He didn't chase the crown, he just held the line. A soldier with a six string and a rebel's spine. Now he rides the quiet, but his voice remains in the heart of the music, in the Texas rain." And in that moment, the journey came full circle. From young troubadours chasing jukebox dreams to elder statesmen shaping the future, George Strait and Toby Keith had walked different roads, but both led to the same place, the soul of country music. Now, George walks alone. But in every song he sings, every young artist he lifts, and every quiet tribute he offers, Toby rides beside him, not as a ghost, but as a heartbeat, a brother, a fire that never went out. And in the legacy they now share, two cowboys ride eternal, one with thunder, one with silence, but both with truth.